Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this seminar series. It's been a really exciting seminar series to kind of participate in terms of the first two sessions, but also it's been lovely for me to actually spend some time thinking about what I might say today and reflecting on kind of that relationship between thresholds and partnerships. But before I kind of go any further, I think just I would like to add my recognition and acknowledgement to that of Cherie and Heather about the kind of the heritage of the people and the land that your universities and institutions occupy, and to just acknowledge, you know, that kind of positioning. I think as a good Scot who experienced, or whose ancestors experienced, the Highland clearances, I think that recognition of land and it is so important. So just to add my acknowledgement to yours, I think is very important. The only other thing I want to kind of say at this stage is some of the images I'm using today were created by a colleague of mine, Dr. Matt Ravenstall, who's a co-author I work with. He's an artist and an art teacher, and some of the images, like the one that's about to appear as Cherie changes the slide, were created by some of his high school art students in response to kind of questions about learning and the troublesomeness of learning. So some of the other images might be familiar, but some of them come from Matt. So if we can have slide number 2, Cherie, which is overview. So in thinking about kind of what I was going to talk about today and what I could say and what I could bring to this Brave Conversations thing space, I think it is important to say that I'm very much a threshold scholar. I have a long interest in students as partners and partnership, but it's not scholarship work that I do in that area. So I think I kind of reflect on a little bit as a practitioner rather than a researcher in that area. And so some of my questions or my comments might be naive, but sometimes I think naive provocations can be actually really helpful to us in thinking about what we do. But in terms of what I thought I would talk about today, I'm going to try and give you a really brief whistle-stop introduction to threshold concepts for those of you who are not familiar, and kind of really give you a very quick outline of what they are. And then I kind of want to pose some challenges or raise some issues that I've been reflecting on both in my own work, but then continue to reflect on a little bit more after Cherie invited me to come and be part of the series. Things that I think are relevant to what we maybe need to think about in relation to partnership work. And they're not by any means complete thoughts. I was so struck in the first Brave Conversation seminar when Cherie said, I'm going to share where I'm at. And I think that's what I'm doing too. I'm sharing where I'm at, and I'm sharing where my thinking is at, in the hope that through following discussion, we can kind of develop ideas and thinking together, because I think that's where we become most powerful. So kind of two of the issues I kind of want to build upon initially are things that I think I've been musing on anyway, but they kind of come into interesting focus when we think about that in relation to partnership. And they're really about this kind of the calls for intellectual decolonization in higher education, and what does that mean for threshold scholarship, but also what does that mean for partnership? Because I think there's something really powerful about that movement in its relation to partnership, if we can create interesting spaces to allow that to happen. So I kind of want to think about that idea of threshold scholarship power and what we might think of as epistemic trouble. I kind of then want to link that a little bit to some of the work that Paul Ashwin has done in talking about that wider student engagement idea, but thinking about particularly his ideas around engagement with knowledge. What does that look like? And what kind of models for knowledge engagement do we think about? Because that to me links to this idea of intellectual decolonization, thresholds, and potentially partnership spaces. So I want to kind of hopefully end today by kind of thinking about partnership spaces and threshold concepts and this kind of idea of knowledge, if that kind of works. So Cherie, can I get you to move our slide again? So just here, I have a quote from Schwartzman, and I put it in here because it kind of reflects, I think, what threshold work is all about. And it's kind of talking about real learning requires stepping into the unknown, which initiates a kind of rupture in knowing. And he says, Schwartzman said, by definition, all threshold scholarship is really about this kind of idea of encounters with the unknown. And I think partnership is definitely an encounter with the unknown. But threshold work is really about that idea of encounters with uncertainty. What happens when we meet that which we don't know in many ways? Can you advance the slide again, Cherie? But thresholds concepts, the idea of threshold concepts started 20 years ago this year. And as Cherie said, we have our anniversary conference, which happens to be in Port Macquarie, Australia, in early July. And I can send information on the conference if anybody would like to come, or possibly Andrea can post a link in the chat because she's also on the organizing committee. But yeah, we're kind of having our 20th anniversary conference in Port Macquarie. But the idea of threshold concepts started about 20 years ago with a kind of seminal publication by Eric Meyer and Ray Land. And what they were talking about is that their work started within looking at academic disciplines. And they were kind of saying that within these disciplines, there are knowledge, there are concepts, there are ideas, there's ways of practicing that when we are introduced to them, as learners, they can be troubling. But once mastered, they significantly change the way that we view the discipline, and even sometimes change our kind of whole ontological view of the world. They're really powerful, transformative constructs. And they're kind of drawing on, the threshold concepts kind of draws on work from anthropology, from Meserve's work on transformative learning, and a whole range of other kind of disciplines. But what we're talking about, things that just once we grasp them, once we master them, they really change how we think about the discipline. Can you advance the slide again, Cherie? And one of the key things that underpin work on threshold concepts is this idea, David Perkins' notions of troublesome knowledge. And there are a number of different forms of troublesome knowledge that Perkins identifies. You know, he talks about ritualized knowledge, inert knowledge, stuff that is conceptually difficult. He talks about the idea of alien knowledge, tacit knowledge, or that kind of loaded knowledge. So there's a whole range of different types of what Perkins calls troublesome knowledge. And he says this is stuff that is challenging for us as learners. And it's not just that it's hard, it's more than hard, because it potentially comes from a place so far away from our current understandings. It's just like being, you know, my mom would say slapped in the face with a wet fish, but I'm not really sure that's a very academic way to describe it. But it's really that kind of, that stuff that hits you, and it potentially stops you in your tracks. And so building on this idea of transformational learning and this idea of troublesome knowledge, Meyer and Land are saying that within disciplines, there are these ideas that have the power to transform, but that also are hugely challenging for us as learners because they are really troublesome. And as I say, a lot of the work has focused very much on that within disciplines, but I think for me, that as threshold work has progressed, we actually can start to see that it's not just about what we might think of as traditional forms of disciplinary knowledge. So it's not just about things like center of gravity or geometric time or supply and demand or opportunity cost, all of which have been identified at various points as threshold concepts by researchers. But it's also about things like the idea of care within the healthcare profession, which isn't necessarily a concept in the way we might traditionally think about it, because it's a way of being, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of practicing. And it could be argued to be kind of an experience. Care is an experience, it's not just a piece of knowledge. So I think as we progress, there's a sense that our ideas and the way that we think about what thresholds might be is changing. And that's something I'm really interested in, to try to not just make it about the knowledge, but about something else. And I think this is something that it offers partnership if we can conceptualize it well. Can I get you to advance the slide again? And I am sorry, I'm going through this very quickly about what thresholds are, because actually I could do hours on just what thresholds are on their own. But just to kind of highlight the kind of features, if you like, of what threshold concepts might be, they're considered to be irreversible. So once we understand them, once we master them, we don't go backwards. You can't unknow, you can't unlearn. They're transformational, they change us quite significantly. They're integrative, they integrate bits of the discipline, bits of our practice that were potentially distinct or separate before, and we couldn't see the connection between them. They're bounded. They often kind of create disciplinary, reflect disciplinary demarcation. So they help us think about, understand why time might be viewed differently to a geologist and a historian, or by a geologist and a historian. And that boundedness is creating real issues when we look at interdisciplinary work. They come with a particular way of talking, a particular form of discourse. So they're discursive. They're reconstitutive. They continually, they allow us to repackage and reconfigure our understanding of our disciplines or our practices. And they are, as I've said before, troublesome. And I think, so these are the kind of defining features. Now, I could tell you there are a number of critiques that where people have problems with this idea of the defining features, because Mayer and Land say, for example, not all threshold concepts tick all of these boxes. They may be all of these things, but they might not be. And I think that reflects the nature of learning, but some of our critics within the area of threshold concepts have a real problem with that, because they want a much more rigid framework. And the threshold concepts framework is, by definition, a little bit more fluid, and that causes problems to some people, but we just don't talk to them, so it's all good. Okay, Cherie, can you move us forward again? I think for me, and where I'm really interested in threshold concepts, is what Mayer and Land say for learners is, as we encounter this troublesome knowledge, these troublesome ideas, what happens to us as learners is we enter this liminal space. And it's kind of, it's described, you can tell, by the way, it's interesting when you think about where people come from, and I must be careful not to do too many of these asides or I'll talk for hours, but you can tell where people come from when you look at their theories, because Ray Land was a literature scholar. So there's lots of metaphor within the threshold concepts framework, and that bit comes from Land. Eric Meyer was an economist, so he's the kind of more straight talker in the group. Ray's more lyrical, I think, in the way he talks about threshold concepts, but there's lots of metaphor, and I'm sure those metaphors come to some extent from the backgrounds of the original authors of the work. But what they're saying is that we go into this liminal space, and liminality coming from the ideas of people like Van Gennep and Turner from anthropology, but it's a kind of betwixt and between space. It's a kind of space where our understanding kind of oscillates and comes in and out of focus. So, it's a bit like being in kind of soup, really. It's a kind of soupy space, and we don't quite know exactly how to get out of it. And actually, we don't always know what's going on when learners are in there. They're just in there trying to work out how to get out and how to master the threshold. And for me, I'm really interested in that. I kind of like thinking about, well, what happens? Because you kind of have to let go of what you already know and be willing to embrace something new, but you don't know what understanding that new thing actually looks or feels like. So if you can progress the slide one more time, Cherie, I think this liminal space is a really emotional or affective space. It's where learning becomes less about ability and capability and much more about things like academic hope or resilience, or just kind of that motivation to get through it, that will, might be stubbornness, who knows, but that determination to accomplish something. So it's a much more emotional or affective state. And here I kind of, when I started thinking about this in that kind of way, I kind of started to look at Glynis Cousin's notion of emotional capital, which is a kind of accumulation of the affective assets, which are the result of varied life experiences. And we might think of emotional kind of capital as really a bit like the kind of affective relation or Bourdieu's notions of social capital, but they are about how we put together these life experiences. Our emotional capital is a bit like, how do we put these together, these life experiences to kind of give us the tools, the skills, what we need to kind of deal with this liminal experience. And I actually think that has a lot of perhaps mileage for us as partnership scholars. And when we think about partnership, because I think partnership's hugely effective, it's a hugely emotional experience. It requires emotional labor and effort to engage in it, because what we do potentially is, and I think this is where I'm going to come to later, but I think what we're doing when we engage in partnership is putting ourselves potentially into these liminal spaces with no real sense of how we're going to get out of them. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. But just moving on, Cherie, if you can just flag up, this is very quickly, just a little quote from John Maynard Keynes. I have to apologize, all the quotes I have are from men. And I suddenly was very aware of that yesterday when I was thinking a little bit about my quotes. I do have some others for other presentations where I draw on bell hooks as ideas, for example, but today they're all men, and I do apologize. But I do like this quote, because Maynard Keynes says, the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones, which ramify into every corner of our minds. And I think this is quite useful for us to think about here. It's not always that we aren't able to learn the new ideas, or that we're not even willing to embrace them. But in order to do that, there's a letting go. And it's in the letting go that often the difficulty lies. So it's that stepping into that liminal space that's the real challenge for us. And I think that's very, very true for partnership work. When I talk to colleagues, for example, about the idea of co-creating curricula with students, there's a shudder. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that in your partnership work. There's that kind of very palpable shudder. We can't do that. And threshold scholars, when you talk to them about it, often say, but they don't know what they don't know, hence where the title of my talk comes from. Students can be involved, for example, in identifying new thresholds, or talking about what thresholds are, or even being involved on creating the curriculum, because potentially they don't know what they don't know. So it kind of becomes almost a way to prevent partnership before it even gets off the ground. And I think what I would say, and others in threshold concepts are not just myself, would say, well, actually, that's one way to view it, but let's think about if that's really useful. And I think one place where that idea has started to be really challenged is coming from the kind of work around intellectual decolonization. And Cherie, could you change the slide again? And again, we could spend hours talking about that idea of intellectual decolonization and what it means. So I'm going to give a very brief comment on it here, but I think it's important and relevant. So obviously the idea of kind of decolonization is much bigger than just higher education. And it really, involves a whole range of approaches, but really kind of what it's underpinned by is a kind of idea that we need to think about the responses to the violences of modernization, and for it might manifest as a call, and this is a quote from Mbembe that I really quite like, because he says that for us, it manifests as a call to undo the global apartheid in higher education. And I just think that's such a powerful idea, and thinking about how we do that is really quite important, because our practices, our beliefs, our ways of doing things are very kind of entrenched in kind of Western Eurocentric ways of doing. So I kind of, these kind of ways of thinking really underpin a lot of my own thinking at the moment, and this is something I've been grappling with in relation to thresholds, and I can't talk about all of that just now, but I think it's relevant to what I want to go on to say in a moment. So if I can get you to change the slide again, Cherie. I think where it becomes relevant is through thinking about, and this is where, because threshold work's very much focused on knowledge, I'm going to talk about partnership in relation to that idea of co-construction of knowledge and where does knowledge come from. And I think both in terms of decolonization, liminal space, and partnership, that becomes really important. And I kind of like the work of Ioki, who suggests that we need to think about the curriculum as a living thing, and not think about something that is static or fixed, but the idea that curriculum is something that is living and fluid and ever changing and subject to change. So I think when we start to think about that, the idea that curriculum is something that is alive and is kind of much more fluid, then we can start to think about, well, how do we make it a lived curriculum, a living curriculum, where students are part of that curriculum and part of that kind of lived experience, that students are not the recipients of knowledge, but they are part of that. Let's build the curriculum together, which I kind of think is really important, both in terms of intellectual decolonization, but how partnership works. And I think that those two things kind of can go hand in hand, because through partnership work, we actually might be able to create greater kind of intellectual decolonization. And what I kind of think becomes really interesting here is Caroline Bailey, drawing on kind of Foucault's work, has talked about the idea of liminality as a kind of heterotopic space, a potentially really creative space that could transform learning if we let it, but where we bring people together in a kind of different way. And I'm never pronounce the name right, but Eduardo Mignolo, who's a Latin American scholar, also talks about the idea, if we want to create kind of this like delinking from this old Eurocentric notions of knowledge and knowledge production, then we need to move into new spaces, these kind of creative spaces, where the identities of those who are involved in the space change. So we let go of traditional identities. So I don't come into the space as a tutor, and they don't come into the space specifically as a student, but we come in as different people because we come into a space that is different to where the spaces we've occupied before. And we say, this is a new kind of space. And in this new kind of space, we can look at new ways of thinking about knowledge. New slide, please. And I think just to kind of introduce Paul Ashwin's ideas here, just very briefly, because this helped me think a lot about, and as I say, I know I'm kind of throwing a lot of ideas at you with maybe no solutions, but I think I'm just talking you through in many ways my journey when I started to think about all of this. But Ashwin talks about, and he's very much framing his work within the student engagement, the broader idea of student engagement, so not simply partnership. And he says a lot of things, but the thing that I was quite interested in is he kind of talks about 3 ways of thinking about the way that learners or students, and I think here I would categorize all of us as learners, not just the students, but the way that we engage with knowledge. There's kind of 3 models for him. There's the kind of consultation model, which is a bit like that very traditional idea. Students learn how to do university. They're there to soak up the knowledge we give them, but it's not interactive. It is very passive. He kind of talks about the partnership model, where students become co-constructors of knowledge. But even in these models, so he's not talking about partnership in the way that many of you talk about partnership, but in that partnership model, whilst he is allowing for that idea of co-construction, there's still a sense that maybe the tutor retains the power. And his final kind of model, which I think is really intriguing, is that notion of leadership models. And these models are predicated on the idea that new forms of understanding and knowledge are created through the kind of through the engagement process. And these models are much rarer because they focus on how students create knowledge rather than how they receive it and how they kind of absorb it in one sense. And I think that way of thinking about knowledge, that notion of the leadership ways of thinking about engagement with knowledge for both learners and tutors, if you like, offers us something interesting, both in terms of decolonization, but also in terms of kind of partnership work. And Ashwin argues that kind of thinking about these 3 models of knowledge to a large extent determine the role that the student plays in the transformation of the object of engagement, which in this case is their own learning and the way that learning happens. And I think we could extend some of those ideas, or I think that's what we need to think about, how we extend some of those ideas. Okay, Cherie, can you just a couple more and then I'm done, I promise. So what does all this mean for partnership, I guess? Kind of, what do we do with all of these 3 strands of things, these threshold concepts, this idea of decolonization and this idea of knowledge? And so I think there's very limited work in the area of threshold concepts and partnership. So Alison Cook-Sather, who Cherie mentioned back in our first Brave Conversations work, has talked about student-faculty partnerships as threshold concepts, but there's very little work that really explores what that looks like and how it feels and what that might, which is a shame because I think there's a lot of potential here. But the idea that partnerships are both challenging and transformative really, I think, helps to emphasize that idea of themselves as them as potentially threshold concepts. Because what we're doing when we engage in partnership is entering to these new, often fairly scary places. They're scary places for us as academics or tutors, but I think they're also scary for students. you know, we potentially as tutors fear that loss of power, loss of control. We can't plan anything. What will happen to my QA? In the UK, the fear is what will happen to our national student survey scores. It's really traumatic. The Office for Students won't like us anymore. But also for students, you know, we know the partnership for students is often complex. They don't know how to be. They don't know what is being asked of them. They don't know how much autonomy they're really allowed. They don't know what's okay, what's not. And I think that's the really interesting issue. When often when we let learners enter liminal spaces, before, like when we think about traditional threshold concepts models, they enter that liminal space, and at least the tutor knows what the end point is. So where the students are hoping to get to, because we've got a definition of these constructs. We know what the constructs, these threshold concepts look like. I think in partnership, one of the issues is we don't know what the end point looks like, or it's harder to see because it varies and it changes with every partnership experience, every partnership project. The end point is probably quite different. So it's a really interesting liminal space that we're in partnership. And I think that kind of often makes it hard for people to enter into them. But what I hope, and if we can change the slide, please, shall we? What I hope is that what we can do is perhaps rethink the place of liminality within partnership work and think about that space a little bit differently. Focus less on that kind of end product. It's not about what we master. It's about the experience of engaging with it, and maybe the experience of moving towards mastery is much more important here in partnership than actually the final outcome itself. And that how we learn to do partnership, how do we learn to be part of partnership, is very much around being in a partnership with the student. And I think what we need to do is maybe think differently about the spaces that we do partnership in. How can we create spaces that feel more equitable, that feel more empowering for both students and academics? How can we, or tutors, and how can we change that? And hopefully if we can find ways to do that, and I feel like I've taken you to a point where I'm saying we need to find all of these things, and now I'm about to say I'm not sure I have the answers. Can you change the slide one last time, Cherie? I don't know that I have any answers, and yet I'm still kind of optimistic about the future, because I think through having conversations like this, by thinking about these new brave spaces, going into these really blurry landscapes, but where we can see a glimmer of hope on the horizon potentially, or at least a glimmer of light, is a good place to start. So having these conversations. So I'm hoping what I've done is leave you with some things to think about. I've shared what I'm struggling with, I think, and where I'm thinking. And I really hope that by being part of this conversation, we can start to find new ways of thinking about what these liminal spaces might look like, and what these partnership experiences could be like, and ways to talk about it so that people feel more empowered and resilient in terms of going into them. So the last slide is just a list, it's not for now, but it's just a list of the sources that I've cited as part of what I've said. And that's me. And I look forward to questions after you've heard from Sophia, who I'm really looking forward to hearing from as well.
Thank you so much, Julie. My head's exploding with a million questions and connections there. As Sophia's just getting her slides up, we're going to move straight into that, but just an encouragement of, do feel free to put your questions in the chat as they come to you, and Heather and I will collate those for the Q&A. But Sophia, I'll hand straight on to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to confirm, everyone can see my slides. Yes.
Yep, good.
Okay,
yep.
Excellent, perfect. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Julie, for such an amazing talk and beautiful, almost coincidental setup for what I'm going to talk about today, which is uncomfortable feelings, embracing circles, and being an amateur in partnership. Before I get into the talk, I just want to give a land acknowledgement for where I'm situated. I'm based at George Mason University, which is in Northern Virginia in the United States, just outside of Washington, D.C. And at the place that George Mason University occupies, I want to give some thanks and acknowledgement to the Potomac River life sources, to the Doig ancestors who Virginia annihilated in violent campaigns, ripping apart their lands with the brutal system of African-American enslavement. And I want to recognize the Virginia tribes who have lovingly stewarded these lands for millennia, including the Rappahannock, the Pamunkey, the Mattaponi, the Chickahominy, the Eastern Chickahominy, the Nansemond, the Monacan, the Mattaponi, the Patawamek, and the Nottoway, past, present, and future. And I also want to acknowledge the Piscataway tribes who have lived on both sides of the river from time immemorial. Aspirational, values-based, highlighting the co-locations, academic selves, student selves, past selves, future selves. We've all been students. I start this talk with an excerpt from a poetic transcription that Lucy Mercer Mapstone and I wrote together from the chapters that make up our edited collection, The Power of Partnership. And when Lucy and I were writing this poem, we borrowed some of these words from Imani Bell, Stephanie Barahona, and Bonnie Rose Stanway's chapter, which focused on the liminal experience of partnership. So appropriately following Julie's really wonderful introduction to liminality. We appreciated in particular how they use the terms academic selves and student selves, past selves and future selves to sort of comment on what they saw as these juxtapositions between each of these things in partnership practice. Juxtapose means to place next to another item for a contrasting effect, which suggests that the two items are discrete from each other, that they sit next to each other, but they don't overlap necessarily. But as Bonnie reflected, students as partners includes these predetermined roles of students and non-students, but those can change over time. Partnership is a very fluid relationship. It can change based on what projects you're working on and who you're working with. Imani agreed, sharing that even as an academic, working in partnership brings up a lot of memories and emotions of being a student. And Stephanie described feeling as though she was living in some sort of purgatory, in the sense that she was experiencing academia between two worlds. And Steph continued, I felt a little uncomfortable because I was the only student taken to a conference and I didn't really know what to expect. I was taken through a portal into the academics universe. Imani, Stephanie, and Bonnie go on to use these metaphors of thresholds, liminality, distance and boundaries, stepping beyond comfort zones to describe how they've each experienced those sort of liminal and fluid relationships and partnership. And this illustration is one of the many really rich visual metaphors that they use to describe that sort of speaking across distance that they have experienced. The illustration is by Stephanie and included in that chapter. So these uncomfortable feelings are my focus today. For more than a decade, I've participated in and studied partnership practices. And I've moved back and forth along the continuum of academic and student, of learner and teacher, of expert and amateur. And today I'd like to share a few vignettes from my experience that will likely sort of merge into one longer story. But through them, I want to suggest that when partnership destabilizes these roles that we often take for granted, we're given an opportunity to notice differently. Whoops. Sorry about that. We're given an opportunity to notice differently and more intentionally. I hope that this talk can extend some of Julie's really helpful framing by offering a grounded example, my personal experience of what navigating liminality and partnership feels like or has felt like to me. And so I want to start by giving you an overarching sense of my story. And thank you, Cherie, for sort of beginning with that, because it's sort of the heart or the crux of my experience in partnership. And I think is a helpful starting place for thinking about what partnership can do or mean. So we'll start by thinking about my first partnership experience as an undergraduate student at Bryn Mawr College in the United States. We'll explore how I developed a sense of expertise in my own student experience. And then we'll move into the challenges of navigating my first professional job after I graduated, and stepping back into that experience of being a novice. I'll share a little bit about returning to the role of student before reflecting on how I think that each of these sites have really affected the potential I see for amateurism in the university. So I went to Bryn Mawr College for undergrad, which is a very small, historically women's college in southeastern Pennsylvania in the United States. That's me. There were 1,300 students total when I was there. And in my sophomore year, I began working in a program started by Alison Cook-Sather called Students as Learners and Teachers, or colloquially called SALT. As a student partner, I sat in on and I observed my faculty partners' classes weekly. I took notes and reflected back to them what I was seeing happening in the classroom. And then we'd meet and discuss those notes, and we'd talk really openly about what we were sort of mutually observing, most often focusing on things like student engagement. Did students seem to have equal opportunity to participate? Whose voices seem to occupy the most space? Which teaching approaches seem to better welcome a wide range of students? And at first, I had difficulty knowing what to say. As Julie mentioned, that sort of feeling of uncertainty of not knowing whether I can truly be in this space was something that I absolutely experienced stepping into partnership. I often worried that my observations weren't useful to my faculty partners who were expert teachers already. And I very much resonated with this reflection by Haley Burke, where she says that I've at times felt that speaking from my perspective as a student didn't carry as much weight as my partner's pedagogical or disciplinary logic for their choices within the classroom. So I looked for ways to bolster my confidence and to sort of lean on the strengths that I do have in this space. I ended up developing a style of classroom mapping that I used to notice when students seemed to be speaking more to the professor versus when they were speaking to one another. Through that mapping, I started to notice when particular students seemed to become nodes in discussion. So sometimes they became a sort of central point because they did connection making work among their peers' comments. Sometimes it was because they came to class with relevant prior knowledge. And sometimes it was because they asked helpful questions that allowed their peers to sort of enter conversation newly or engage with the clarification that the professor sort of offered. So my faculty partners and I started to look for ways to help more students play this kind of a co-facilitator role in the classroom. The value of this kind of work was how it built on my expertise, which was that of being a student. So as I reflected on how my faculty partners' teaching made me feel, I questioned, did I feel welcomed, curious, nervous, encouraged, rushed, silenced? And I noticed the affective reactions among my peers that offered a valuable insight into their experience of the learning environment. I ended up designing my undergraduate major around this work and study. So I majored in educational identity and empowering pedagogy. That was the title I gave my work. When Alison went on sabbatical in spring of my senior year, there were several student faculty pairs from the fall semester who wanted to keep working together. And my faculty partner and I were included. So Alison and I planned what it would take for me to step into the role of facilitator. That's me. Of the weekly student meetings that we had come to really depend on so heavily. So in addition to those regular meetings with faculty partners, the student partners were meeting in student-only groups. And these were spaces of solidarity. They were a place to practice how to offer feedback. They were a space to share challenges and to celebrate the successes of our partnerships. This kind of work is not something you can easily speak to your roommates about. So having these spaces was really key to us feeling supported and having opportunities to process what we were experiencing. And continuing those weekly meetings that spring furthered my sense of confidence in my perspective as a student, and also my sense of confidence as someone who had experience now with pedagogical partnerships. Around the time I graduated, an opportunity arose to work in a teaching center at a small liberal arts college in Texas. The goal of my position as written was to launch a pedagogical partnership program. So I stepped off the plane in San Antonio in 106-degree Fahrenheit weather in August with 2 duffel bags containing all of my belongings ready to go. And within 2 weeks encountered my first prickles. My boss called me into his office to let me know that I came off as very empowered, quote unquote, in meetings with faculty and university leaders. He asked that I not presume to have expertise that I don't have. And what I hadn't realized until this moment was that we had really radically different communication styles. And he was a lot less ready to practice partnership than he'd initially let on, or even just initially believed. We ended up having a really challenging working relationship for the rest of my first year. Even though I was hired for my student expertise, that became the biggest flaw in our employer-employee relationship. My boss critiqued me for what he saw as my failing to develop a work identity, and for not knowing my place when interacting with superiors. And I felt overwhelmed as I was trying to navigate this really difficult working relationship and trying to learn this new and different institutional culture and trying to create a program that suddenly I wasn't able to create. So this was a particularly bad work experience and work example. But I think the wider experience of former student partners butting up against hierarchy is not an uncommon one. Alison Cooksaver, Melanie Botti, and Anita Intem explained it as they may find that they experienced a diminished sense of agency and authority than what they experienced as undergraduates in a partnership with a faculty member. And Alison, Melanie, and Anita acknowledged that sort of diminished sense of agency might be relatively common for anyone entering their first professional position from being a student. But for student partners, what's different is that those who have participated in these partnership programs know what it is to have their experiences and perspectives valued. And they've worked to develop an awareness of the unexamined status quo with an eye towards possibilities for constructive change. And so what I experienced, and what I think others often experience, was this deep misalignment between the kind of critical eye that I had developed, and which was so valued in my college experience and environment, and so valued among my faculty partners, and then the kind of obedience or acquiescence that's expected in a more hierarchical working culture. And I navigated this challenge in a couple of ways. First, I leaned really heavily on my identity as a learner. I asked constant questions to better understand what was expected to me. I really embraced and continued to position myself as a novice in all of the spaces I was entering, so that I was less threatening, so I could learn more, and so that I could figure out how to navigate this environment. I also engaged in outside scholarly spaces where I could continue to develop my work in pedagogical partnership research, even if I wasn't able to enact those practices in my institutional space. At the time, and I think still today, there's been quite a bit written on students' transition into a partnership experience, but much less on transitioning out of a partnership experience. And so for me, developing that international community was really essential for finding support. And as Cherie mentioned in the chat, this is me and Lucy Mercer Mapstone. And this is the two of us facilitating a workshop on partnership around this time. The other way I navigated this challenge was that I didn't stop gently pushing for student involvement in our work, or offering, with some caveats, my perspective. So, you know, there were values that I held from my partnership experience that I found it was important to maintain. My supervisor ended up leaving near the end of my first year, so I stayed on in our center for 2 more years to continue programming as we filled his position. And with the support of my new director, I was finally able to launch and lead the pedagogical partnership program that I modeled on my SALT experiences. And that program is still active today. Being a former student partner, now leading a program of student-faculty pairs from across the institution, I had to spend a lot of time theorizing about partnership. So I started to reflect on my own experiences and what I'd observed others experiencing, to really think about how can student partners be encouraged to develop that sense of epistemic confidence that allows them to share their perspectives. How can faculty partners be better primed to step into the space of vulnerability and openness that's necessary for partnership practices and sort of the deep engagement required? And how can pedagogical partnerships shift our assumption about one another in really productive ways? I left my position in fall of 2018 to begin a master's degree at Elon University, where I was able to continue asking these questions about student engagement and partnership relationships. And at Elon, I extended my view a bit to include sites where students and faculty neared the kind of reciprocity and co-creation that we hope to see in partnership. So I was thinking about sites like the co-creation of learning assessments and rubrics, research mentorship relationships, project-based and community-based learning, and other sort of spaces like that, where the values of partnership are often, but not always, embraced, but that the embrace of those values can really enhance the goals of each of those sort of projects. As I worked on my master's degree, Lucy Mercer Mapstone and I also worked on assembling and editing the Power of Partnership book. So I was now in this unusual position of being a graduate student and also actively publishing literature on partnership practices, which meant that in some spaces I was very much a novice, and in other spaces I was leading reading groups with faculty about my work. It's just an odd space to sit in. I wouldn't have been comfortable sitting in that position, I think, without the confidence that I had built up as an undergraduate student partner. I'm also not sure how willing I would have been to sit in the in-between space as a graduate student and scholar, as a novice and an expert, without the practice that I gained just sitting in that liminal space of partnership. In my relationship with faculty partners, sometimes I was a partner, sometimes I was enrolling in their class in a future semester and was a student in their class being graded and assessed by them. Sometimes we were co-writing research articles together and were colleagues. So there were lots of different ways in which we occupied different roles in relation to each other, and ways that we had to navigate being okay with that sort of fluidity. And as Sam's illustration centers, the meaning exists in the gap between. So I'm now in my PhD at George Mason. I continue to do scholarship on teaching and learning. I continue to practice partnership as much as possible, no longer in sort of formal structured programs, but in those informal other spaces of engagement and relationship. And the role of doctoral student is another inherently liminal role. Sometimes I'm a teacher, sometimes I'm a learner. Most often I'm a blend of both simultaneously, as I think we likely all are. In a lot of ways, I think students as partners has become my theory. The underlying goals of trust, reciprocity, respect, and co-creation form the foundation of all of my work. The scholarship of teaching and learning is my research. It's the scholarly community with whom I'm in conversation. It's the method by which I do most of my work. And educational development is my practice. It's the theory of change that I hold. My goal of transforming universities for students and enhancing student learning by working with professors. So through this process, I've been wondering what it would mean to be considered an expert in these things. And that might seem counterintuitive because each of these sites are characterized by collaborative, interdisciplinary teaching and learning. Each of these practices value the variety of perspectives and experiences that people bring to the space from afar. Typically, people don't start in one of these spaces and continue exclusively in them. They start in a discipline or sort of another sort of external scholarly space, and then do this on the side or in addition to or next. So it's a bit unusual for me to have always been in this space. To have students as partners and to have SoTL be my discipline or maybe my anti-discipline. And that can be unsettling for other people. Last year, one of my advisors said, when you leave the house, you have to put on a pair of shoes. So she asked, what shoes will you wear? And what she meant was, how do you intend to make yourself legible in an academic space that still holds tightly to disciplinary boundaries and keeps building impenetrable walls of expertise? And it took me a while to figure out how to answer that question. But eventually I came to this. Even a borderland, a boundary or a threshold has a space where one might stand. And that ledge is my home. So I've spent a great deal of my PhD experience steeped in theories. I felt especially energized and encouraged by Edward Said's understanding of amateurism, which he described as the desire to be moved not by profit or reward, but by love for and unquenchable interest in the larger picture, in making connections across lines and barriers, in refusing to be tied down to a specialty, in caring for ideas and values despite the restrictions of a profession. And I'd like to propose that my experience is just one example of the ways that pedagogical partnerships can make space for amateurism in the university. As we think about the growing diversity of our student bodies, highlighted in our last set of talks by David Hornsby and Maisha Islam, we have to do that work of connecting across lines and barriers, of caring for equity and justice despite the restrictions of our professions. We have to take that love for and unquenchable interest in the larger picture in order to move beyond the sort of narrow disciplinary projects that we might otherwise engage in order to sort of step into the space of progressing transformational student learning at our institutions. As I wrap up, I want to return really briefly to Haley Burke, who was in my graduating class at Bryn Mawr. That's us. During an unfortunate period of orange hair, so we can ignore that part. But I mentioned earlier that Haley was trying to combat the feeling that her perspective didn't carry as much weight in her partnerships. And the way that she did that ultimately was by looking for ways to specifically highlight how her lack of disciplinary knowledge could be an asset to her partnership relationships. And I think this might actually help to answer Julie's question about the folks who say, well, what role can students play in threshold concept work? What Haley did was help clarify jargon and improve access in the classes that she worked with by asking for definitions of non-obvious terms and reminding her faculty partners to be explicit about the assumptions and the tacit knowledge that they held that they didn't always think to make explicit to their students. She asserted that it can be fruitful to embrace students' position of amateur, as it can be a tool for helping professors develop their teaching techniques. And when I reflect on my own experiences in partnerships or striving towards them, this especially resonates because I've always asked more questions. I've always come with fewer assumptions about how things should be based on how they've always been, in part because I don't always know how they've always been. I've always been in this in-between space, and so I haven't been brought up in a disciplinary expectation in the same way that a lot of my doctoral peers have or faculty peers have. I will say, though, that I don't think this is only the case for me, although I do acknowledge that my sort of always in the intersections path through academia is still pretty uncommon. In a new chapter that I've written that's coming out soon, I suggest that students are an exciting addition in the equation between amateur and professional because students are still becoming within their disciplines. And I might actually edit that today to say that students are still becoming, period. One of the great benefits of pedagogical partnerships is the opportunity to be questioned, to not have your assumptions taken for granted, to be prompted by your dialogue with someone different from you, to think newly about what's possible. And I think if we extend this practice to that and this kind of ethos to a larger scale, if we practice getting comfortable with unsettling, restless, discomforting spaces, we have a chance to shift how we do education. That proposal is not a new one. I don't want to say that I'm coming up with something entirely new here. In 1999, the feminist scholar Megan Buller proposed a pedagogy of discomfort. And she asked, what do we, educators and students, stand to gain by engaging in the discomforting process of questioning cherished beliefs and assumptions? And she went on to suggest that the ethical aim of a pedagogy of discomfort is to willingly inhabit a more ambiguous and flexible sense of self. So I think that's how I'd like to close my talk today and open up our discussion space and Q&A space by suggesting that partnership might allow all of us to inhabit that ambiguous and flexible sense of self. Thank you all. And I will share these slides with you so you can see the citations and follow up, but yes, thank you.
Julie and Sophia, wow and thank you. Also, Sophia, so many kind of interesting reflections and connections back to theory. I get a chance to carry on the conversation after this, so I'm going to stay quiet and invite our participants to ask either Sophia or Julie the questions that that you're sitting with as a result of these final two presentations. Please feel free to turn on your camera or just unmute, sorry, and jump in. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Perhaps I joke with my colleagues that I try and practice always going third in a discussion because I get very excited and I can jump in. But if there is an uncomfortable silence, maybe I can jump in now. So Sophia and Julie, one of the many things that I'm holding as a result of both of your conversations, I'm thinking back to the idea of disruptive ecosystems that I talked about at the initial talk, and this interaction between self groups and university systems. I'm kind of pondering on this idea of readiness to engage at these 3 points, readiness to engage in partnership from a sense of self, within groups, and then systems. And in thinking about this idea of liminality and amateurism and the ability to sit in uncertainty, to sit with discomfort, I'm wondering whether that is the indicator of readiness. And if so, how do you kind of get at that empirically? What are your thoughts on that? Are there other indicators of readiness for this work? But those are the words that I'm sat with of like, that's where people need to be at to do this work. Maybe that's where our policies and systems need to be at. So yeah, interested if you have any thoughts or other indicators of readiness for this kind of work, either personally or institutionally.
This is the moment where Sophia and I don't know who's supposed to go first. I'll say something very quickly and then Sophia, hopefully you've got something to add. I think the idea of readiness is really important, and I think there's something about that, learning to be comfortable with being uncomfortable or discomfort. There's some kind of interesting work around as individuals moving into liminal spaces does require us to be willing to be unsettled and to live with that uncertainty. And some interesting work that kind of thinks about how do we know. So I don't know how we get at it empirically, I think is my short answer, but I do think it's really important to see if we can find ways to do that, because I think that is really, really important, both at the individual level, but also at an institutional level. And maybe Ian Kinchin's work on pedagogical frailty might be useful there, but I don't know the answer, but I think it's an important question.
Yeah, I love this question. I don't want to suggest that people have to already be at the stage of being uncomfortable with discomfort before entering partnership. I don't think that that needs to be the sort of minimum qualification for entering these spaces, in part because I think a lot of the comfort that I developed in this liminal space happened through doing partnership rather than was something that I sort of came into feeling ready to take on. But I think there's some really great work by feminist scholars. Alison Bailey has written about student resistance to difficult concepts, especially concepts regarding the sort of interrogation of privilege. And one of the things that she writes about is the way that students engage in epistemic preserving pushback. They use these techniques to sort of like put up these defensive walls to say, no, you can't touch the assumptions that I hold dear. And one of the ways that she responds to that, because I think this is a common theme in a lot of feminist pedagogy, because of the way that feminist pedagogy aims to question deep assumptions persistently, is that she sort of recommends naming vulnerability as she's seeing it happen, and trying to make space to a citation of feminist pedagogy. There's lots, but Alison Bailey is the person I'm talking about right now who writes about it. Other sort of good definitions, Hassel and Nelson sort of broadly talk about what signature feminist pedagogy looks like, and I can send those in the chat in just a bit. But she talks about naming vulnerability and sort of making space to sort of reassert that it's important to practice that. And then I think Bell Hooks's writing on sort of making space for emotion and vulnerability is another way, sort of in broader ways, to practice doing this so we can get more comfortable with sitting with the emotions that we're feeling and recognizing that those difficult emotions should be and are a natural part of the learning process, and not something that we should be trying to sort of rationalize away.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that often one of the hardest things, whether we're talking about partnership or just learning, is the idea that it's okay not to know, and it's okay not to be there yet, and it's okay not to be kind of, a fully formed whatever. And I think there's a lot of pressure now, particularly in this age of instant information and instant answers. We're all talking about chat GTP or whatever you call it here, and these AI approaches to learning. But I think one of the dangers, and they have potentially some interesting affordances when we get our head around them, but one of the dangers is that they reinforce this notion of instantaneous certainty, or potentially instantaneous certainty. And I think that's something that we all need to try to almost resist.
Thanks both so much. Any other questions from our audience? We've got 7 minutes left before we're at time.
Hi, this is Sharon. I put a question in the chat about maybe the intersection between our speakers and critical pedagogy, and I'm thinking specifically around Freire's concept about shifting roles. I'd love to hear if the speakers want to respond to that in any way.
I love Freire's work, and have cited it in many, many other spaces related to partnership. I think absolutely the idea of co-creation, the idea that we can't dismantle oppressive structures in isolation, that sort of dismantling and confronting oppression is an act of love, that all of those things are sort of critical to understanding what I think partnerships goals are or can be or should be. Certainly they're critical to the way that I've always sort of practiced and been in partnership spaces. Julie, did you want to share any or add anything?
I think really just to absolutely echo what you've said, I'm also an advocate of Freire. I love the work, and I just think that idea of learners as being cared for, you know, I quite like Neil Nodding's work on kind of the ethics of care as well, and I just think that we need to think about that notion of acts of love and caring within learning really, really differently. So yeah, kind of just supporting what Sophia said, really.
And Sharon, you might be interested in, I'm just frantically trying to find the link to the article. Kathy Bovell's written about, I think it was 2013, 2014, about some of these ideas not being new ideas, just old ideas we never got around to implementing, and drawing on, you know, Sophia's, you know, books. You know, you could go back as far as Dewey. Some of these ideas are not new, but we don't see them kind of radically manifested in the academy. And Kathy Bovell's article on that kind of picks up on connections around kind of Freire's principles for engagement and the role of education and so on. And the intention around these series is to kind of make sure that the practice in our discussions doesn't become a-theoretical. Because and that's where I think all of our speakers have tried to make those connections to it. So I'll as the questions kind of keep rolling in, I'll see if I can find a link to that quick and pop it in the chat. And to also say that the other presentations that are part of this series, they're all available on TLI's YouTube link, and we'll be able to collate those and send them to you as a playlist, so you can see, if you haven't been able to attend others, see how these all fit together.
There's a very quick answer to a question in the chat about students as partners and the teaching excellence framework, which is a joy we have to work within in the UK. Very quick answer is almost none. Almost none. It just, because it's all metrics driven and students as partners is messy and doesn't get to quality, like measurable test evaluation scores really easily. So pretty much no.
Yeah. And it kind of ties in, doesn't it, then, with the idea of this being a risky practice, institutionally, individually, because it cannot be easily, you know, Julie, the quote that you had about not focusing on mastery, but focusing on the experience, it's inherently countercultural because it's anti-metric. You can't, you know, by saying that you're going to enter into an unknown space, it's completely antithetical to those kinds of movements and stuff.
It is, absolutely. And kind of one of the things that we talk a lot about in Thresholds is this idea that once we enter into these liminal spaces, there's not a fixed time point at which we come out of them either. You know, for everybody, that kind of the time we're in there or the time we're part of that experience will vary. So you can't, I mean, I've taught students in the past where I had one student one year who absolutely hated my module and everything I did. And she gave me a really tough evaluation at the end. And a year and a half later, I just got this email from her and she went, I get it now. And it was like, it had taken that long for her to really get kind of what we were trying to do with the module and what it was about. So she didn't like it at the time, but she really appreciates it now. But in terms of my NSS scores, that trumped, you know, that trashed them. So it's a really interesting issue about doing these things, encouraging students to be part of that liminal space and grapple with these ideas is risky if you live, you know, when you're working in a very matrix driven system, because they don't necessarily all get to the point of mastery at the end of the module, which is a challenge.
I'm already playing the YouTube for you. It sounds like Apologies about that. I was just trying to find the YouTube links and it started automatically playing. I think we may have time for one more question, and then we come to the end of our time together today. So any final questions?
I did see that Kelsey had a question in the chat about how you determine that partnerships are reciprocal. And then also, what foundations for care do you enact for parties in partnership, especially when engaging with troublesome knowledge? Which are really great questions. Julie, I don't know if you want to start.
Okay. So I think I might pick up on the care issue because I'm not 100% certain about the answer to the question about reciprocity, partly because I can't even say it. I think, so for me, I think that notion of care in relation to troublesomeness, I think is about, in a really practical sense, I guess, for me, that's about making it clear to your learners, or if you're engaging in partnership, which is maybe a troublesome space, it's about that, trying to create spaces where there is that sense of we are here together, we're exploring this together. I know when I teach, like anything time I teach, I very much talk to the students about this idea that we are in this together. It's a kind of co-inhabited space, and that care isn't about everything being the same for all of them, and that learning isn't about everything being the same for all of them. So in one sense, my way of enacting care at a very practical level is allowing for that notion of differentiation in the room. So I'm not sure, Kelsey, if that really answers your question, but it's a kind of maybe a quick answer to what is quite a big question. But I think it is about the way we communicate what's going on in the room, or talk about what's going on in the learning space with the learners, and how that feels like we're saying to the students, it matters to me, or like we talk to our learners about, it matters to me if they learn, it matters to me if they succeed, if they're progressing in the way that they want to do. And so it's about showing that without saying, I'm going to do everything the same for all of you, and that's my way of caring, which I think is a really problematic notion of care.
And I think linked to that in terms of reciprocity, just really briefly, I especially appreciate the way that Bell Hooks talks about teaching and learning should be a space of mutual empowerment. We're not only thinking about how do we empower others, because that's not exactly something, you empower yourself, you sort of give space for others to enact or be empowered. But that the kind of solidarity, I think, that can be enacted in partnership by recognizing that we have this shared goal and purpose, that all of that sort of helps to create a space for reciprocity and for mutual benefit and learning and risk taking.
You almost become really reluctant to use the word safe spaces these days because it's become such an overly used term. But I think in its sense, creation of those spaces is not about spaces where learners are never troubled, or they're never unsure, or we are never unsure or never troubled, but it's a space where it's okay to be all of those things, and that sense that we could be all of those things, empowered, disempowered, troubled, scared, exhilarated. We can be all of those things all at once, and that's okay. And creating that, to me, is about that's what the safe space is. It's not some of the kind of ways that safe spaces have been talked about.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Julie and Sophia. I think we can draw this session formally to a close. In terms of next steps, Heather, we've been sending out the YouTube links to each recording to those that are registered, but they are all available from this speaker series on the Taylor Institute's YouTube site, so you can view them there and share and leave comments, and just as a finishing, we've asked lots of questions in these 3 seminars, and I know the speakers, we're all keen to keep the conversation going, and we very much want to create a community around these speaker series. So if there are things that you're interested in that you'd like to keep discussing, please do reach out either to us as organizers or directly to the speakers here today. And once we've caught our breath, I think Michelle Yeoh, myself and Heather, we'll put our heads together and start thinking about the next seminar series. So in terms of the topic and speakers. So please do keep an eye out for our brave conversations in SoTL movement as we're going forward. Other than that, I'd like to say thanks. Heather, any final closing words from yourself?
No, just thanks again to our speakers today. That was a wonderful way to close our first series, and we do look forward to seeing everybody back in the fall for the next one. So thanks to everyone who's made this such a success so far.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and goodbye.
All right, well, seeing none at the moment, please join me, all of you, in thanking Cherie for a really thought-provoking talk. And I think based on some of the comments we've seen here, a lot of us are going away with some things to think about and ideas about how to apply this in our own context. So really appreciate that. We hope to see you all again at the next part of this series, and everyone who registered for this talk will get some information on that when the time comes. So please keep an eye on your inboxes for that. And thanks everybody again. Have a great rest of your day.